I'm Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm John Harwood. Welcome to the New York Times First 100 Days edition here on MSNBC. We're waiting for the White House press briefing with Robert Gibbs, the press secretary.
It's going to be a tight schedule today, too. Gibbs is appearing in between speeches by the president today on fiscal responsibility. That is the watchword of the day.
Now, you tell me, Savannah, how do they make the pivot to fiscal responsibility after telling Congress, we need you to spend $800 billion as fast as possible?
Well, that's exactly why they're doing it, because they don't want to get pigeonholed as just these tax and spend liberals. They want to show they can be responsible, too. And the president has made that point all along. Whenever he announces something big in terms of spending, he always has that caveat. We've got to tighten our belts, too.
So is anything going to come out of this summit today, or is it just yap?
A lot of chatter, but we're getting a little bit of a preview of the budget. And as you know, he's set some pretty ambitious goals, too, to cut the deficit in half by the end of his term, which would be a big deal if he can do it.
Now, President Barack Obama has been in office for 33 days. With a $787 billion stimulus plan already in his back pocket, he now turns his attention to the first federal budget, beginning with today's Fiscal Responsibility Summit we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and this morning he talked to the nation's governors, and he said he'll be keeping a close eye on how they spend that money they're getting.
So let me be clear, though. This is not a blank check. I know you've heard this repeatedly over the last few days, but I want to reiterate it. These funds are intended to go directly towards helping struggling Americans keep their health care coverage. We want to make sure that that's what's happening, and we're going to work with you closely to make sure that this money is spent the way it's supposed to.
Jeff Zeleny is political correspondent for the New York Times. And Jeff, I want to talk to you about some of the Republican governors. Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana came here to Washington complaining about the stimulus bill. That brought a pretty quick response from the president. Let's play the tape.
I appreciate the opportunity to come and to listen to the president, to talk with him and his senior administration officials. We had a chance to meet with senior cabinet officials, and I think that healthy dialogue is very good. I think there could have been a very different stimulus bill written. There could have been a stimulus bill that was truly targeted and temporary, focused on infrastructure, focused on the kinds of tax credits that would have gotten investment moving in the private sector.
If we agree on 90% of the stuff, and we're spending all our time on television arguing about 1, 2, 3% of the spending in this thing, and somehow it's being characterized in broad brush as wasteful spending, that starts sounding more like politics. And that's what, right now, we don't have time to do.
Well, Jeff, you heard what the president said this morning to governors. Is he basically saying, get over it, let's move on?
Well, Savannah, I think he is definitely saying that he won the election. He said that time and time again, but that's his message today. He is saying get over it and moved on. But it is about politics. There's no question that Governor Jindal is positioning himself to be a leading Republican voice on this opposition. He's giving the Republican response tomorrow to the president's address to Congress. So what we're seeing right now is sort of a preview for potentially things to come. But there are a lot of Republican governors who support the stimulus spending, so Governor Jindal is only representing one point of view.
Jeff, let me ask you about how the president puts a little meat on this idea of fiscal responsibility. Everybody knows the two big entitlement programs of Medicare and Social Security are where, in the long term, the consequential shortfall is. So what's the pace of action, and are Democrats willing to go along with the things that President Obama says he wants to do, say, on Social Security?
John, I think that's the key question right there. Are Democrats willing to go along? And on Social Security, they appear that they probably aren't. My colleague Jackie Collins reported this morning that House and Senate Democrats are resisting President Obama's idea to sort of put Social Security under the knife, if you will. So what they're trying to do is say, look, at the end of my first term, we're going to have half of the deficit under control. Who knows if that'll happen or not, but it is part of their message. As they're asking to spend more, he is trying to, as Savannah said earlier, remind people that he is keeping his eye on the deficit and cutting it back, at least to some degree.
Well, if Democrats can keep him from pursuing Social Security reform, at least for the time being, are they going to do the same thing on Medicare? And then is all this talk about fiscal responsibility going to turn out to be a little empty?
Well, if it turns out to be empty, he'll have a problem on his hands. There's no question about that. But I think this is just the early gambit here. Social Security is one item. Health care reform is a priority for this administration, perhaps more than Social Security and entitlement reform. So I think the White House is still going to have a bit of a muscle here in terms of persuading Democrats to come along with them. But they've not yet spent a lot of time doing that because the first month has been devoted to the stimulus plan.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it. Now, we're still awaiting the arrival of White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs for the daily press briefing. Let's bring in Chuck Todd, NBC News chief White House correspondent and political director, who's live at the White House. Chuck, what are you expecting from Robert Gibbs in terms of amplifying this message about cutting the budget deficit in half in 4 years and trying to get the red ink under control?
Well, I think you're going to have a little bit of that, but I also expect to watch this turn carefully. Jeff picked up on it as well, and that is, I think you are watching a slow turn of this White House message-wise and issues-wise to health care. They're trying to frame health care as part of the economic crisis, part of the budget crisis. You heard Peter Orszag in his opening remarks at this fiscal responsibility summit talking about the importance of getting health care costs under control. We know a lot of businesses need to figure out how to get health care costs under control for themselves. So it appears, and then tomorrow's speech, at least a third of the domestic part of the speech that President Obama makes is going to be on health care. So I suspect we're going to continue to see this slow turn all of this week of moving, not just about fiscal issues and the budget, but getting to health care, where we're going to start seeing health care as big of an issue as the economy in general.
Chuck, can I ask you about this projection today that he's going to try to cut the deficit in half by the end of his term? Obviously a pretty ambitious goal there, but doesn't it rely a lot on some pretty rosy scenarios that we will be able to extract ourselves from the war in Iraq without having to spend that money directly in Afghanistan, talking about the economy getting better, bouncing back more quickly than perhaps might actually happen? You think that Gibbs will be pressed on some of that stuff today?
Well, he might be, but then again, they've been hit for not being optimistic enough, right, in the president's rhetoric. So maybe this is the way that they will fight back and say, well, we're being optimistic in some of our budget projections. But look, a lot of budgets are that way. You know, one thing I want to remind folks about this budget that the White House is going to unveil is that it really is a very detailed, broad outline. It's not going to be the full budget. Why? Because it's Congress that's going to start writing the details of this thing. Obviously, what the president wants to see, some of the broad brushstrokes that he would like to see with the budget are going to be part of what he introduces to them. But a lot of the blanks get filled in by the folks in Congress. That said, look, this line, you're absolutely right. But then again, the president put a marker out there. I'm going to have the deficit by the end of my first term. Well, guess what? In September, in October of 2012, if he's running for re-election, we'll know. We'll know then. Voters will know then. And so it is one of those promises he's throwing out there for himself to be held on. And, you know, I guess now it's up to us to put on our green eye shades.
Let me ask you about another promise, which is this pay-as-you-go idea, which sounds terrific, and a lot of Americans can really relate to it. The fact of the matter is, doesn't Congress already have those rules? Democrats have those rules for themselves. They're not that great at following them, are they? What's the difference here between that and what the president's proposing?
Well, I think that is one of the ways that they're trying to spin this budget and spin some of the deficit numbers, which is to talk about, hey, we're going to, get rid of some of the tricks that were used in the budget process in the past to cover up some of the actual deficit numbers. For instance, when you do the pay as you go, but if there's a natural disaster, that money doesn't get counted in the budget, and so all of those parts and tactics they're trying to talk about so that they can somehow spin this very large deficit that they're going to be announcing this week to the American public.
Hey, Chuck, you mentioned something I'm interested in a moment ago, which was that the idea that the White House or the president may be talking down the economy. Is that something that they're concerned about? Do they think that there's some bite to that charge, that he's been too negative, too dour?
Well, I think one of the things is we will find out how seriously they take that charge tomorrow night, John. I think in their speech, the tone of it, we're starting to hear that it's possible the tone. You will hear that optimistic Obama from when he was a candidate for the presidency, and the optimism that he was credited for always sounding hopeful and all that stuff, that we will possibly hear a more optimistic President Obama then. So I think that tells you that they are a little more sensitive to this charge than they realize, because as you know, John, markets are about confidence sometimes, have nothing to do with actual numbers. They respond to confidence, and maybe they are being a little more sensitive to this idea that their words can matter as far as the confidence of the markets are concerned.
Chuck, thanks for being with us. I know you got a briefing to cover in a moment. We'll come back to it live as soon as that Robert Gibbs gets to the podium.
Okay, and MSNBC is the place for politics. As you know, be sure to stay with us for all-day coverage Tuesday, leading up to President Obama's live primetime speech to Congress, 9 o'clock tomorrow night.
Now, Citigroup is in discussions with U.S. officials for the government to take a larger stake in that troubled bank.
And that aid would come from a capital injection. It would increase the government's stake in the bank by as much as 40%. CNBC's Melissa Lee joins us now with the latest. And I guess, Melissa, the question to you is, if bank nationalization is such a dirty word, at what point do we really say that a bank is owned by the government if a 40% stake is a big chunk? I mean, I guess it's sort of in the eye of the beholder.
At this point, it could just be a matter of semantics. I mean, 40% is not a majority, but it sure does give the government a big say over potentially how the bank is operated, how it pays its executives, and how it conducts its business. So we should note that CNBC has just learned that a government deal in which it could increase its stake in Citigroup to up to 40% could happen later today or as early as tomorrow. This just literally came in, so we could be expecting a deal at any point now. And just to go over the details of it and how this would actually work, it wouldn't necessarily involve a capital injection per se. Remember that the government, after injecting capital under the old TARP, has a 7.8% stake in Citigroup, $45 billion in preferred shares. And the way the government would increase its stake is that it would convert a sizable chunk of those preferred shares into common equity. Now, the impact on taxpayers, because this is important for a lot of folks out there, is absolutely nothing, because this would not involve a capital injection, although there are questions at this point as to whether or not this increased government stake could lead to yet another capital injection under the new bank bailout plan. More importantly, though, for shareholders, what this means is dilution of the shares, which essentially means the stock price would go down because the government is becoming a bigger stakeholder in all of this. And you might wonder why Citigroup approached the government, because we did learn also that Citigroup approached U.S. regulators as late as Sunday night to increase its stake. Well, simply because the stock price fell to 18-year lows last week, touching below $2 a share. $1.63 was that 18-year low. And also, this week, stress tests will begin under the new bank bailout plan, and federal regulators are expected to focus on one measure of a bank's capital position, which is known as tangible common equity. Essentially, what you need to know is that under this measure, Citigroup appears to be weak, and so that was a big concern out there. But again, a deal in which the government could increase its stake to the higher end of the 25 to 40% range could come as early as later today. Back to you.
Melissa, thanks so much for that report. We're now going to go live to the White House podium, where Presidential Press Secretary Robert Gibbs is now briefing.
Can you talk a little